Hello learners, I am Garima Avasthi and today we are going to talk about the advantages of activity as a method of learning over other approaches. We have already talked about what activity is, how it is used, how it is more useful in teaching. Now we are going to talk about why is it preferred by teachers over other approaches. So as you all know that activity combines three important elements of teaching learning process. So when we talk about the process of teaching and learning, that is within the classroom, there are three important aspects that we see. One is the teacher, who is supposed to be the knowledge giver, and then there are the learners, who are the knowledge receivers or constructors of knowledge, as we say, and then there is subject integration. So all of these are combined, that the teacher is taken into account, the learners are learning, and the subject matter is also discussed. So all these processes are present, are combined. We have already talked that how learner-centered approaches are better. So as you all know, activity is a learner-centered approach. And when we talk about the advantages of activity, we are saying that while doing, activity means learning by doing. So the knowledge is gained or is constructed by the student while learning, while doing the activity, right? Which is in his or her own environment. So the child is very comfortable because he or she is in his or her own environment and is doing activity according to their own pace. Now, this approach takes into account the four essential elements which are required for learning. One is the need, right? What is the need of the child at this moment? So, because the child is himself or herself doing the activity, the need is addressed. We talk about interest of the child. Children are always more interested in doing practical things, in doing practical works. So it takes the interest of the child also into consideration. So when we talk about little children, we first introduce them to language through songs, through poems. That is what we do. And then slowly and steadily we move where we teach them or we introduce them to stories. We take them to different storybooks. And so a need is created, a need is there also. They also recognize that this world of books is something that we really need to know, and there is an interest in language which is generated. And then we go on the mental ability. Now the books also differ. When the child is really small or in say first or second grades, we generally in first grades we introduce them to pictorial books which are called picture books. They are generally have more of illustrations and less of text. So and as we move forward, the text increases. So that is according to the mental ability of the child. So if I take storytelling as an activity, then I will do an activity where according to the mental ability of my child. And then is social context. We do activities which are relevant to the social context of the child. They are useful to the child and they are also not very foreign for the child. Then we talk about why activity. So first is, I've already discussed this in the previous example, that activity can be in any form. It can be in the form of a game, it can be in the form of a story, role play or song. So game is generally physical games, or you can play, if I take again the example of language, then we can play word games, right? We can give them different alphabets, we can jumble them and we can say that create as many words as you can. And the person or the team maybe who creates the maximum number of words wins. So it's a game, it's an activity. Story I've already discussed. Role play is where children take on adult roles and they play it amongst their peer groups. And then there is song, which children do in a group generally, or if You see them alone sometimes during play field, then children will be humming those songs. So activity has various forms. These are some of those forms. Activity also provides a scope for each child to participate. So if I generally, what we do is we teach children. So if I take any instructional method, say for example lecture method, the most commonly used method of teaching, then I don't know whether my child is learning or not, right? For me, I have to take an assessment, maybe written or oral, and then I'll find out if he or she has learned something or not. But activity means that every child is going to learn and every child is going to participate. Because in lecture method, I may ask questions from some of the students. It may not be possible for me to ask a particular question or discuss something with each and every child. But in activity, I am able to do that. So every child is able to participate in an activity. Now, an activity can be either an individual activity or a group activity. In an individual activity, generally the children are able to set their own pace of learning. They may be able to do it on their own, sometimes with your guidance, or maybe you have done an activity with them once and then they want to try it again, which is on their own. So it can be individual or it can be a group activity where, so for example, a word game, I can give individually some jumbled words to the child and say that create as many words as you can, some letters, and from that you create as many words as you can. Or I can say that divide yourself into groups and these are your letters, create as many words as you can. Or some other activity. There are different types of activity also. So some require different point of view or some discussion. So it is better at that time that I tell them that this is what we need to do, why don't you think about it? Or for example, if I've just told them about a story, I can stop mid-sentence and say that now create your own story. So one of those stories, I have to give an example, is that every one of us has heard this, so I'm going to use this, which is that there's a race and a tortoise and a rabbit are going to be in the race. And ultimately what happens is that the rabbit is so overconfident that he goes to sleep and the tortoise is steady and slowly he walks away and wins the race. Now on the other hand, I may tell the children that, you know, they started a race and then the rabbit slept. But what happened? After that you may change it, or they just started the race, now what happened? So it can create different stories which can be in a group because people have, or children have different ideas. Then when we talk about activity as a method, we say that involvement and participation in each activity gives a sense of satisfaction to the student. No child will feel as if he or she has been left out a little. They are involved in the activity, everybody is participating, we've already discussed this, and so they are involved, they are doing something or the other. Or sometimes they create an art piece which we called as a collaborative art piece, which is that there's a huge chart paper and you give them a theme and you say that, you know, together you create something. So everybody is able to contribute something or the other in the activity. If you do it in little higher classes, there are some children who will say that, you know, maybe my drawing is not so good, so I don't want to do an art activity. So you can tell them that, you know, maybe somebody else can draw and you can color, you can fill in or do something else, you can write on a chart paper. So this way you are involving everybody in a particular activity, and slowly and steadily their interest in that particular subject, which earlier they really don't want to do, is also created. Then we talk about the last point, which is that activity is also useful in a sense that by making little changes, small changes, an activity can be used for achieving other objectives. We can use one activity multiple times. We can use it for different things. So generally what teachers do is create TLMs, which are paper TLMs, say for example flashcards, and these are pictorial in nature. You sometimes may use them for a language activity, sometimes you may use it for a small warm-up game, sometimes you can use it for say addition, because you can, if there is A for apple, you can also say, okay, this is O for orange and this is say some other fruit, S for strawberry. So how many fruits are there? You can collect, so that is maths. So one activity or can be used, or one TLM can be used in different ways by making just small adjustments. So in a classroom where activity is taking place, what does this classroom look like? Now children are generally in these classes very involved in what they are doing, in the work that they are doing, and generally they are unaware if the teacher is even there or not, because they're so involved in their work. So a teacher acts as a guide here, or as a supervisor. He or she is monitoring what the other children are doing. So children are involved in work and the teacher goes and takes rounds, and the children are not really disturbed about it. They are not really disturbed about the movements because they have a task which they have to complete. They are busy doing it. So that is what a classroom looks like. Children talk amongst themselves. They are able to talk amongst themselves, and it is not the regular chitter-chatter, but rather something useful, construction of knowledge, sharing of knowledge, knowledge sharing, the different processes which takes place in these classrooms. They are able to manipulate materials. When I say manipulate materials, it means that how can I use a particular object differently for different purposes. So a bottle may not be used only as a bottle. As a bottle, we say it is used for drinking, but a child may use it in a role play as a rolling pin to make something, or the children can do something else. So they manipulate materials, they imagine that, suppose this is this, and they use it accordingly. Then they try different arrangements and ways of solving a problem, which is that specifically in systems which are Montessori based, or which have a lot of blocks or other TLMs, then children try out different arrangements that are there. If from blocks a tower can be made, what else can be made? So they'll try it. They will say a seriation is happening, so they'll do an upward seriation, they'll do a vertical and a horizontal seriation, or they may make a completely different house out of it. So there are different arrangements that they'll try, and there will be different ways of solving a particular problem, which again is very useful, because here, rather than going to the teacher or complaining to the teacher, which generally happens that, ma'am, this is happening or that is happening in a class, or he has taken my pencil. This won't happen if children are regularly involved in activities, because they know how to solve a problem. They take on the responsibility, they take on the ownership, and they try different ways of solving a particular problem. It may be related to their peers, it may be related to the activity at hand, or if there is a lack of resource, how can we substitute it, for example. So that is done. Then children are also easily able to identify the aim and objective of the activity. That is, what are we doing and why are we doing? Generally, if you teach them from a textbook, they read a lesson maybe, then you ask them, okay, what is it? They'll be able to tell you maybe the topic at hand, like for example, Unit 6, Food and Nutrition, for example. So they know that that is the lesson, but what are you learning in food? Then they not everybody, but yeah, most of the children will be a little mum because they won't know. And why are we learning about this? How is it useful? Generally, this happens in subjects like social science, where children are like, why are we learning this? So it is important that if these things are done practically in the form of activity, the children are able to know what are we doing and why are we doing it. So they are able to identify the aim and objective of the activity very clearly. So activities, basically, bottom line is that they are engaging and they encourage students to achieve the learning objectives, which are defined by the teacher or by the syllabus or curriculum. But yes, then is this, if you can see, is a classroom where there is activity. It's an activity based classroom. Children are doing an art activity here. So you see, they're sitting very closely to each other. They're very near each other. But they are busy doing their own work. They're painting. They're not talking at all. Very disciplined. Each one of them has their own trays. And they're busily doing their work. So this is what involvement looks like. So this is what activity-based classrooms are all about. Now, concretely, the advantages are that activities already discussed also in some sense or the other, but activities provide enough scope. Enough scope for what? One, a child's individual style. Every child, and it has been recognized by our educational researchers also, that every child has a unique, has an individual style and pace of learning, and they have different methods. So activity has the scope. If I am not able to understand addition in the spur of a moment, I will understand it, but it may take me some time. And if I'm doing an activity, I can do that activity slowly or I can finish it very fast, but it's on my pace. So the child has a space where what are they learning, how are they learning, that is on them sometimes. That they themselves decide what is their pace, or they'll come to it. So that is one. Then second is self-learning. Activities provide scope for self-learning, where I as a child am able to create knowledge. And as already told, that generally if you do activities which are very low cost or no cost, or from material which are from their surroundings, which you should, and the child will definitely go and do it again in their home environment. And that is when it promotes self-learning. And then the next point we talk about is ability of inquiry. This is a very good thing, that they develop a key learning aspect, which is how to inquire, how to question. And not just question, but also if there's a particular thing that I'm doing, then if we are doing something, questions arise. Theoretically, I may read about something. Say, for example, theoretically, I read about rainwater harvesting. It's very easy. I say that save rainwater on rooftops. But if I say that, okay, let us all come create a model, then they'll say, okay, how is it done? The rain is falling on the roof, but I have to store it. So I can't really store it on the roof itself. So I need a tank, and then maybe how does the water travel from the roof to the tank? So then they come up with the ideas with a pipe or something, or you tell them that generally if children are stuck, that it is through a pipe, and then they say, okay, now how do we make this pipe? So there are different things which come up in their mind and which are very practical aspects of something. They're able to know about their subject matter a lot better. Then is self-assessment of knowledge. Rather than me as a teacher who is assessing them, who is trying to say that I saw you doing this and this activity, or maybe, if we talk about not activity, then generally what happens is that you teach something and then you take a test, whether it's oral, whether it's written, but that is what you do. As a teacher, we assess children. But here, in activity, children are able to assess themselves because they have a task at hand. So if they're able to complete the task, they know that their work is done, they're able to understand. If they are not, then they'll take time. They may ask for your help or for the help of their friends, and then they are able to create something, but they are able to assess their knowledge. And they're also able to construct new knowledge. This is something I've already talked about in detail, that children, if the surroundings are familiar, are able to construct new knowledge. And so activity in a way is good when you're teaching them about new concepts. You tell them and then you also give them something or the other which is able to help them construct knowledge rather than just be a receiver, rather than just be a passive receiver. They are active in their own process of learning and they become involved learners. And if you see this arrow going there in the last point, if you become an involved learner, then an involved learner has automatically an interest in learning. If you are so busy doing that activity like it was in that earlier picture, if you're so busy doing something, you're involved in doing something, then obviously it will create interest. It's a pleasurable activity and it will create interest in the act of learning also for you. The next advantages we talk about is that activity is able to address or achieve the 4 pillars of learning. Now, what are these 4 pillars of learning? One is learning to know, learning to do, learning to live together, and learning to be. Learning to know, which is we are knowing new things, we are knowing new concepts. We knew about tomato and now we are discovering more about tomato. So we are knowing, learning to do. That is, we are also learning to doing things now, not just sitting, but practically learning to do. Then we are learning to live together. By live together, I say activity is mostly a group work. So I am working in groups, I am cooperating, and hence I'm learning to live together with my fellow peers, with my friends, with my classmates. And I am learning to be as in myself. I am becoming an independent learner day by day through this method. Now, activity, as discussed during this presentation, is a useful approach of learning and in the process of teaching and learning, and it has many advantages over other approaches. But here are some others, which is one, it is a very useful approach for MGML classes, which are multi-grade, multi-learning classes. These classes are basically you may be familiar with the concept that generally it happens in a single teacher school or where there are less teachers and more students. So one teacher has to manage different grades, different levels of students. So I have, generally there are 3 classes, so I am a teacher and I have first, second and third class which I have to teach. Now they are different curriculums, different syllabuses, and there are different children who have different learning needs. So what do? I am just one teacher. How do I make myself available to everybody? How do I make sure that every person or every child in my classes is learning? So through activity, if I explain an activity or children are involved in an activity, then they are self-learning, and hence after some monitoring, I can go to the other class. I can go to not the other class but rather other students, and maybe I can do another activity with them and then come back and check on them, or I can do something else with those students. But activity is a useful approach, and also I can create one activity which has 3 levels. So a particular activity can be done by smaller children in a way, and then there is a step 2 which you do when you are in grade 2, and then there's a step 3 which you do in grade 3. And if I don't limit myself to grades, then there are some children who are in grade 1 but they are able to do the step 2 also. So I'm also addressing different learning levels here. This is something which is, I think, the central advantage of this approach. Then we talk about different learnings which are happening during activity. Even if I'm doing it in group, I am doing, and hence there is individual learning. Self-learning is that maybe I do that activity afterwards, or there are some lessons which during that activity I have learned, I have come up with. And then there is peer learning, where I am not just dependent on the teacher for my learning, but I also take views of my peers, of my classmates. Then activity provides the use of multiple methods. I can use different methods. I may also use different activities at a time. So we were talking about language classes a little earlier. So we may start with a song and continue with the story. So we are using the method of song in storytelling. We are using multiple methods here. Then in this learning, we are talking about several abilities which are required at the same time. Like the child needs to think, the child needs to reason, not with himself or herself, but also with her or his peers, and search for alternatives in case of problems, respond in socially desirable ways, because we are working in a group. So emotional control also comes in way, and that is how socially desirable ways and emotional control are also together, and we learn to cooperate. So a child cannot really say that I want to do this, or I will do this, but as a group they need to cooperate, and hence it is important that they develop some abilities. So maybe they have developed a turn-taking ability where then say, okay, both of you want to do this, or 4 of you want to do this, let's take turns and do this, right? Then the child develops a holistic personality, because this method ensures cognitive, socio-emotional, as discussed in the earlier point, and psychomotor aspects in the children. All 3 developments are taking place, and it helps develop the holistic personality of a child. Now lastly, we conclude that activity is a goal-oriented task, where we decide this is what you learn, and we decide this is how you learn, and once you complete that activity, once you do it, then you have achieved your goal and you have learned. Now the learner gets spontaneously involved. As a teacher, we don't really have to get their attention, because children are eager to learn, they're eager to do things, so they can spontaneously involve themselves in the activities. So they are involved automatically without our pressure. Also, they derive pleasure in achieving the learning objectives. What are we learning? What are our learning objectives? Whatever they are, we are likely as children to do them better, because learning is fun for us now. So studying is fun, and we will be able to clear our concepts easily. So bottom line, I would just like to say that in this presentation, we saw what are the advantages of activity over all the other approaches, and if activity as a method of teaching and learning is managed properly in the classroom, then this method has several, in fact numerous advantages, which will facilitate students' learning. It will make it more contextual, it will make it more relevant for them, and learning takes place in a meaningful manner. This is it for today. We will meet again for another lecture. Thank you.